Hello, and welcome to Matters of Mind. Once again, I'll be reviewing a book today. This one's not on my Jordan Peterson great books list, but I thought it would be a great one to cover because of the timing. It's incredibly prescient. Now, the book I'm covering today is The Queering of the American Child by Logan Lancing. Now, you also see James Lindsay's name here, and he did help develop the book along with Logan, and that's how I came to find out about it. But before we go too far, I'm going to ask that you please like and subscribe. It's incredibly helpful to the channel, and I always appreciate that. If and when you do, you will be notified when I create new content. So thanks again for doing that. Now, the idea with this book is to really help educate people on what it means to queer a person or to be queer and how that relates to education today. Now, one of the interesting things is I can imagine somebody looking at the name of this book and then first saying, oh, yeah, they're trying to make our kids gay. And I think that's part of the tactic, not by the authors of this book, but by the people who utilize these terms to refer to their own ideas. So it reminds me somewhat of anti-racism. So anti-racism during 2020 and all the upheaval during those years after the George Floyd death, it was, you could say, you could stand up against what you see as anti-racism, and the first thing people will say, what do you mean you're against anti-racism? Aren't you against racism? Doesn't that mean you would be anti-racist? And that was a really convenient way to avoid talking about what specifically anti-racism, according to the people who write about anti-racism, say it actually is. The same thing with Antifa. I remember talking negatively about Antifa, whether it's their tactics or anything that they were doing, or their ideas. And people would just pop in the comments and say, oh, Antifa stands for anti-fascist. And it was like I was supposed to stand back and say, oh, now I get it. Because they call themselves anti-fascist, that means they're against fascism. So I should be pro-Antifa because they're against fascism, and fascism is bad. Thanks for updating me. And it's the same thing here, to where they can call themselves queer and have queer theory. And immediately when somebody pushes back against queer theory, oh, so I guess you're homophobic. You don't like queers. Maybe you're actually queer and that's why you're against queer theory. Without actually looking at what queer theory states, is blatant about writing, what's in their literature, their tactics, their goals, etc. I think it's the exact same thing. And even if it might be by accident and not purposely done that way, it's at the very least incredibly convenient. So, when it comes to queer, let's first talk about what it means to be queer. Now, according to the theorist, and let me say this up front, everything that I say here today isn't necessarily mine or Logan Lancing's opinion when it comes to talking about what queer theory is. This is queer theory as stated by the people who created, wrote, developed queer theory. All of these definitions are theirs. So, according to the theorist, queer is both an identity and an action. Those two things are very important to understand the difference. The first thing is that it doesn't necessarily mean gay, although it can refer to somebody who is gay, because the identity of being queer means little more than standing or having an identity that falls outside of the norm. That's really all it is. And to expand on that, I'm going to use a quote from a famous queer theorist so you can understand a little more specifically and understand the context around what they're saying. This is from world-renowned queer theorist David Halperin. Unlike gay identity, which, though deliberately proclaimed in an act of affirmation, is nonetheless rooted in the positive fact of homosexual object choice. Queer identity needn't be grounded in any positive truth or in any stable reality. As the very word implies, queer does not name some natural kind or refer to some determinate object. It acquires its meaning from its oppositional relation to the norm. Queer is by definition whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. There is nothing in particular to which it necessarily refers. It is an identity without an essence. It is an identity without an essence. Now, that's a little prosy, but what it really means is that it's a negative identity. So it doesn't point to any specific thing that it is. All it means to be queer is to stand outside of what society considers normal. This is why it's so easy and to be queer in the sense that all you have to do is look at what's normal and then declare yourself outside of that norm, and that in itself is queer. Now, there's also queer the action. Now, queer the action is, and I quote, to destabilize the social, cultural, and political normalizing structures that work to solidify identities, and in doing so, skew power toward the norm. So, because they believe that all norms are regulated and connected to social power, what they're doing is through their identity, challenging the norms, challenging everything legitimate, and then going into places and actually through their identity and their actions, they will be queer and then queer a space. That's what it means to be queer as an identity and queer as an action. You stand outside of the norm and then you find normal spaces and you challenge those normal spaces. When you put those things together, you have a person that is and does queer because you have to have the identity and then act upon the identity by queering spaces, as they call it. Now, a perfect example of this is something most of us have heard of, and it's been somewhat controversial lately. It's Drag Queen Story Hour. Now, Drag Queen Story Hour both is and does queer. It is queer in the sense that the person who's reading the stories to children is queer. They have a queer identity. They are dressing and presenting themselves outside of the normal standards of society. They're doing queer the action by presenting themselves and reading stories about children who fall outside of the norm. So the space that they're queering is the children in the library and the ideas that those children have about what it is to be normal. So Drag Queen Story Hour is queer and it is doing queer, which is a perfect example of how those two things come together. Now, it may sound cynical to call this type of thing a tactic, but it's important to know, like I said earlier in the video, that what they write about their ideas, their theories, they also include their tactics and their goals. So instead of taking my word for it, let's see what they say about that Drag Queen Story Hour and its aims. Now, this comes from a paper on drag pedagogy. If you're not familiar with the term pedagogy, it's essentially the art of education. So there's a whole literature on education and drag, using drag for education in order to queer students. Here's something directly from one of those papers. Though Drag Queen Story Hour publicly positions its impact in helping children develop empathy, learn about gender diversity and difference, and tap into their own creativity, we argue that its contributions can run deeper than morals and role models. It is undeniable that Drag Queen Story Hour participates in many of these tropes of empathy, from the marketing language the program uses to its selection of books. Much of this is strategically done in order to justify its educational value. So even there, in their own literature, when they describe their program, they are saying that they are using tropes of empathy, diversity, and inclusion to as a tactic for their actual goals that are stated here within that paper and other places. Even the term family friendly, they go on to say, is an old school queer code to identify and connect with other queers on the street. So not only do they have an alternative goal, but they also purposely talk about coded language that they use to make things seem family friendly, but it's really a code to say that it's queer friendly. It's blatant, it's in their paperwork. I'll put the references down below so you can look for yourself. Now, when it comes to what their goals are, that was one of the most unusual things that I noticed about this particular paper. It was preparatory introduction to alternate modes of kinship. So they're going into these schools, they're being and doing queer as a way to introduce children to alternate modes of kinship. Now, that doesn't sound like reading, writing, or arithmetic, but it does sound like a way to introduce children to different types of relationships between people, which, if you just say it like that, it doesn't sound too wild, but we have to remember the context here. It's not necessarily going in and teaching kids about general relationships. It's teaching them specifically about relationships that fall outside of the norm. And as a parent, I don't know that my 5, 6, 7-year-old needs to be instructed on that by drag queens. But regardless, that is their goal. That is what they say. And it's quite blatant what they're doing. Now, the question still stands, but why? Why would somebody assume and then take action on this concept that they need to be queer, stand outside of normalcy, and then go into somebody else's space and queer that space by challenging the norms that already exist? This is what we call queer Marxism. Now, I've heard Dr. Lindsay talk about this, which is something that Logan Lancing also talks about in this book. But there is a link between Marxism and queer theory. And they say that queer theory is really just queer Marxism. And here's why. So, queer theorists see normalcy as a type of property, to where normal people, normal society, have created normalcy arbitrarily in order to create a power structure and then maintain that power structure. To maintain that power structure, they reproduce that normalcy with their children by teaching children what is normal. Those children grow up to be normal, and then they reproduce that normalcy throughout society that keeps normal people in power. The word power is repeated over and over on purpose because that is how they see society. There are powerful people and there are those without power. And the powerful people are oppressing those without power and finding ways to create societies that maintain that power differential. Now, if that sounds familiar, it should, because that is exactly what Marxism does. Marxism looks at the people who own property, the capitalists, as people who have power, and those without property are those without power. Again, it frames society as an oppressive power dynamic. Now, the people with property, the capitalists, create a capitalist society that then makes capitalism the norm and reproduces the problems that keep them in power and oppress those without. It's really the same dynamic. Now, the same thing is done with critical race theory. And I'll put a little grid here so you can quickly see how these are all really the same thing, but just with different people in power, different groups in power. Critical race theory says there is a group of people of a certain race who have power. They use the normalcy and supremacy of their race to create a society that keeps people outside of that race oppressed. And there's the power dynamic again. You have the race of the people with power and the people in every other race without power, and that's the power dynamic at play. And they're reproducing that power dynamic by creating whiteness as the normalcy, as a thing to attain, which is why sometimes you can see people talk about whiteness not necessarily just as the color of your skin, but a political stance that is taken. So you can see how queer theory wants to abolish normalcy to destroy that power dynamic. Marxism wants to abolish private property to destroy that power dynamic. Critical race theory wants to abolish whiteness to destroy that power dynamic. And you can do the same thing with ableism or fat studies. All of these things fall into that same power dynamic framework that has people who are oppressed and the oppressors, and looking at ways to challenge that power structure and take the people that are oppressed and center them as the norm by breaking down all of those categories and flattening out that curve. Now, there's so much more to talk about when it comes to what's in the book. Logan Lancing did a great job of not only helping me understand queer theory, what it means, where it comes from, and how it's worked its way into our medical, psychological, and educational authority structures. Um, but it ties everything together, and it also gives you some options on what to do at the end of the book as well. Now, somebody like myself who lives in a rural area, pretty far away from any major city. I'm 2 hours from Philadelphia, 2 hours from New York. I don't have too many worries that something like this is really going to push through in our school districts. But there are a lot of kids out there who might be, and already have been affected by some of these ideas. So, regardless of my personal um, threat of this happening to my kids, I think it's important that we all make sure that we understand what they're saying, what their goals are, what their tactics are, because there's a lot of kids out there and a lot of parents out there who may not be as well versed on what's happening. And this book is great for people who want to understand this dynamic. Now, on the optimistic side, we do see that there's been a lot of pushback against these ideas. Some of it's through legislation that looks at banning some of the gender affirming care that includes puberty blockers for young children. We're seeing that a lot of the effects are not reversible, and the evidence is scant for them actually providing any help to kids that have these issues. Some gender clinics are being shut down. The Tavistock in England has already been shut down for a lot of the same reasons. No evidence that this stuff really is helping kids. Another thing, we're starting to see whistleblowers come forward. So there's people that have been working at these clinics who are coming forth and talking about a lot of the problems that they see in the manner in which treatment is delivered to these kids. So I think there's been a turn here, and it's going to be a bit easier for people to feel like they can talk about this and stand up and push back. But the different organizations, psychological, medical, and education associations have a lot of this already embedded in their structure, in their writings. So it's not necessarily that this is over. And I think we need to make sure that we're aware so you can spot these things when they're happening in your area, in your school, and pay attention to what your kids are saying and coming home with. And this book can definitely help you understand that and do that as well. So again, thanks for joining me here on Matters of Mind. If you like and subscribe, I really appreciate it. It's super helpful. The book, The Queering of the American Child, is available on Amazon. That's how I got it. It was also interesting reading the reviews. A lot of great reviews. A couple people did the typical, oh no, this is a bigoted piece of trash. Don't buy this. Another white man doing this, that, and the other. But I noticed that most of those reviews weren't actual verified purchases. So they probably never read the book and they just are screaming at the top of their lungs about ideas and books they haven't read, nor do they understand. Again, I'll put some references below so you can see the quotes that I utilized and where they came from. And I hope to see you guys around and have a great day.